Welcome, everyone, to the Daily Objective brought to you by the Ayn Rand Center UK. And today is going to be an Ask Me Anything episode on the subject of classical music. This is an episode I've been wanting to do for some time for a couple of reasons. Probably the one thing that I enjoy most about teaching, and I've been teaching for more than 15 years now, is engaging with students and asking their questions. I always find this fascinating because, especially when students ask questions that are a little bit off the wall or unexpected. First of all, I really like the practice of thinking on my feet, being challenged with some new perspective or new idea or new query that I hadn't even thought about. And sometimes the most interesting learning experiences that come through the process of teaching come from unexpected comments, unexpected feedback, unexpected questions that I get from students. So I always find that very exciting. And also, I'm quite curious to know what aspects of music, whether it's the history of music or the appreciation of music, are most interesting and most relevant to the viewers of this particular channel, so that I have some idea of what kind of topics I may want to focus on in future episodes on aesthetics or future episodes on music. So we've already had a couple of questions, and I also have a topic that I want to raise in a few minutes in response to a discussion that I've had with a few objectivists a couple of weeks ago. But the first question that we had, which came as a super chat yesterday, was a question from Megan Ribbons. And the question was, how would you compose the three odes of Antigone? So the reference here is to the famous play by Sophocles from the 5th century BC, which of course is one of the 8 great plays discussed by Dr. Peacock in his series. We were just having a discussion on this with Robert and James in the Keeping It Real episode about an hour ago. I find this question quite interesting from a purely historical point of view, because around 1600, when a new genre of music, which would come to be called opera, which is the fusion of music and drama, when opera originated around 1600, it was actually in response to a desire to bring ancient Greek tragedy back into the present day, or to put it another way, to resurrect Greek tragedy, which hadn't been seen on any stage for nearly 2,000 years, to bring it back into a present day context with present day music. And not surprisingly, many of the early operas were based on stories, tragedies, or ideas from ancient Greek mythology, whether it's the story of Apollo and Daphne or the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. There was one interesting twist, which is that many of the early operas actually had a happy ending. So whereas the actual Greek tragedies usually ended with the death of the protagonist or multiple protagonists, the early composers and the early audiences of opera didn't like those kinds of downers. They wanted something a little more uplifting, a little more positive. So it was a convention in the 17th and even in the 18th centuries for an opera to have a so-called lieto fine, a happy ending, tacked on at the end, usually involving a deus ex machina, where one of the gods or goddesses comes down from the clouds and turns a bad situation into a good situation. So there were lots and lots of operas on the subject of Greek tragedy. I don't know of any famous Baroque operas from the 17th century or early 18th century, specifically on the story of Antigone, which is part of the Oedipus trilogy of Sophocles, the first play, Oedipus the King, then Oedipus at Colonus, and then the story of Antigone, who was the daughter of Oedipus. I don't know of any operas from that period on the subject of Oedipus or on the subject of Antigone, but an early 20th century composer, actually a Swiss-French composer named Arthur Honegger, Honegger is spelled Honegger, Arthur Honegger composed an opera on the subject of Antigone. And I believe there have been a few other operas in more recent centuries on this subject as well. But if you actually want to hear how a famous composer, a famous early 20th century composer, tackled the subject of setting Antigone to music, I would definitely recommend looking into Arthur Honegger's opera on the subject. Now, the question was, how would I compose the three odes of Antigone? I'm not exactly a composer myself. I did study composition in university, primarily for the purpose of learning about music, so that I could have an understanding of what's inside the composer's mind when he's writing. I'm not exactly sure how I would approach the task of writing or setting to music the three odes of Antigone, but I would definitely look at how Honegger handled the task. And actually, there have been other early 20th century composers who wrote operas based on plays by Sophocles or Euripides. Another one that I would mention is Richard Strauss, who was one of the most important German composers of the early 20th century. And he composed a famous opera on the subject of Electra. Electra was the daughter of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. And there's a whole trilogy which deals with the murder of Agamemnon by his wife, and then how Electra and her brother Orestes take revenge on their mother and her lover, and then how the son Orestes is pursued by the Furies. That's been set many, many times by many, many different composers. But Richard Strauss's setting of that particular story is really wild. If you don't know that music, I highly recommend looking into it. The second question, which came earlier this morning from Mary Aline, has to do with what composers would you recommend to people who are relatively new to the subject of classical music? A lot of that depends on whether a person already has some particular inclination or particular predisposition to some period in music. I know that certainly many viewers of this channel, many objectivists, are drawn to music of the 19th century, music of Romantic composers, since a lot of that music is discussed in the objectivist literature, in some of Ayn Rand's fiction and nonfiction, which is perfectly understandable. And so I could make certainly quite a few recommendations in that era. But for somebody who's really new to music and who doesn't know quite where to start, I would actually recommend beginning with the Viennese classics of the late 18th century. And by Viennese classics, I mean, above all, three composers, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Why do I recommend starting with those three composers? Besides the sheer excellence, the outstanding craftsmanship, and the outstanding aesthetic values in their music, I think listening to the music of those three composers is a very good way of training the ear to be sensitive to the highest and deepest possible musical values, particularly in the realm of purely instrumental music, in the realm of, say, the symphony, the concerto, the string quartet, the piano music. The works of those three composers are absolutely unrivaled, unparalleled by anything before or since. If you want to see the art of music, and particularly the art of orchestral music, the art of chamber music at its highest, I would definitely recommend paying close attention to the works of those three composers. And I think it's safe to say that all the great composers who came after Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, including Schubert, Mendelssohn, and Schumann, Bruckner and Brahms, all the great Czech composers, all the great Russian composers, all the great English composers, they took a lot of inspiration and a lot of influence from the three great Viennese classics. Now, if I were to give, say, a top 10 list and a top 12 list, and this is not necessarily my personal favorites or the composers that I necessarily regard as the greatest in history, I would even question whether that's necessarily a legitimate way of looking at the question. It's certainly not quite my way of looking at it, but if I were to recommend, say, 12 composers who span a period from about 1700 to about 1900, I would certainly start with the two great late Baroque composers, Bach and Handel. They're an excellent starting point, very representative of the music of the 18th century. Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven I've already recommended as representative of the late 18th century, shading into the beginning of the 19th. Then slightly later into the 19th century, certainly Franz Schubert. In many ways, I would actually put Schubert in the same category with the Viennese classics, with Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. And then getting into the middle part of the century, Mendelssohn, Schumann are certainly outstanding. And then to mix it up with a few non-Germanic composers, I would certainly recommend from Poland, Frédéric Chopin, from Hungary, Franz Liszt. Their piano music is absolutely second to none. And then, from the late 19th century, there's so many wonderful composers. There's Germanic composers like Brahms and Bruckner, French composers like Gounod and Bizet, particularly famous for their operas, Russian composers like Tchaikovsky and Rimsky-Korsakov, Czech composers like Smetana and Dvořák. Yes, that is the correct pronunciation, Dvořák. There's Norwegian composers like Grieg. That's just a very brief starting point for some of the composers that I would experiment with. And then I could even go into the early 20th century and talk about Mahler, Strauss, and many others. But that's a kind of a starting point that covers the period from roughly about 1700 to about 1900 or the very early 1900s. Another question from Mary-Aline is how should a novice who's unfamiliar with opera get into the genre of opera? So the most popular operas, the operas that are most frequently performed by our great opera houses today, basically it covers the period of music history that I've been talking about, the very late 1800s. So really for most opera audiences today, opera really begins with Mozart. Although I'm pleased to say that more and more attention is being given to operas from the earlier part of the 18th century, including the really outstanding operas of Handel, who was just a wonderful dramatist, a wonderful composer of Italian opera. And then there was from the middle part of the century, there was a German composer, Christoph Willibald Gluck. Gluck is spelled G-L-U-C-K. He's a really great opera, a really great opera composer, slightly older contemporary of Mozart, so I would recommend him. But then really the bread and butter of opera companies and opera audiences today is the great operas of the 19th century. So beginning with Italian composers like Rossini and his followers, Donizetti and Bellini, they belong to a particular school of Italian opera known as bel canto. Bel canto is Italian for beautiful singing. And it refers to, on the one hand, a school of singing, but it also refers to a particular type of Italian opera, particularly Italian opera from the early 19th century. And then following on the heels of the great bel canto composer, there's, of course, one of the greatest Italian opera composers of all time, Giuseppe Verdi, who wrote so many wonderful operas, and who's of interest to us, particularly because many of his operas were inspired by great literature, including some of the great plays of Friedrich Schiller, Victor Hugo, and many others. So actually, if you really want to get into opera, I might even start with Verdi, and I might start by reading some of the plays of Hugo. For example, read Hugo's famous play, Le Roi s'amuse, which means the king amuses itself, which became the basis for one of the most famous Italian operas of all time, Giuseppe Verdi's Rigoletto. And it's interesting to compare the original source material with the adaptation. Of course, one of the greatest plays of all time, it's one of Dr. Peikoff's 8 great plays, is Friedrich Schiller's Don Carlos, which was famously set as an opera by Giuseppe Verdi. We had a little discussion of that about an hour ago with James and Robert. And actually, even many great Schiller scholars have praised Verdi's operatic adaptation of the play, that he cuts away some of the extraneous subplots and some of the minor characters and just focuses on the essence, the relationship between the prince, Don Carlo, and his father, Philip, their relationship with Elizabeth of Valois, and the Marquis de Posa, the Grand Inquisitor, all the wonderful, colorful scenes that make the play so great are embodied in really spectacular music by Verdi. One of these days, I have to do a whole lecture series or a whole course on great operas as literature, philosophy, and music. I think that would be a very interesting subject. Of course, no discussion of Italian opera is complete without mentioning the so-called Verismo school, which emerged at the end of the 19th century. And Verismo is roughly equivalent to realism or naturalism in drama and literature. And the first 2 great Verismo operas were Cavalleria Rusticana by Mascagni and Pagliacci by Leoncavallo. Those are 2 really great operas. And perhaps later on I can put together a playlist, or I can include some of these titles and some of these composers in the video description later on. I'll talk to Daniel about that after the show. And of course, the most famous Italian verismo composer was Giacomo Puccini, and some of his operas are among the most famous, the most frequently performed operas in history. La Bohème, Tosca, Madama Butterfly, Turandot. You absolutely can't go wrong with these operas for sheer beauty of melody, for sheer memorability of the dramas and the characters. And then just to mention a couple of non-Italian operas, of course, probably the most famous French operas of the 19th century are Faust by Charles Gounod. That's based on the famous drama or dramatic poem by Goethe, and Carmen by Georges Bizet. That's based on a short novel by Prosper and Mérimée. Those are, perennial favorites with opera lovers. So I would, if you like French opera, if you love the French language, I would definitely recommend starting there. And then as far as German opera is concerned, there's Beethoven's Fidelio, which is a very interesting product of the cultural milieu following in the wake of the French Revolution. At the time of the French Revolution, there was a lot of interest among artists, among intellectuals, of the whole question of freedom versus tyranny. Indeed, many of Schiller's plays emerged out of a similar kind of intellectual culture. But so Beethoven's Fidelio is the story about a woman named Leonora who disguises herself as a man and gets a job at a prison so that she can find and rescue her husband, who is being kept in a dungeon as a political prisoner. So anyone interested in liberty, in Lockean individual rights, definitely look into Beethoven's Fidelio. That's a really fascinating opera on the subject of freedom versus tyranny. There's a great German composer who's perhaps not as well known as he should be, Carl Maria von Weber, spelled W-E-B-E-R, not to be confused with Andrew Lloyd Webber, different spelling, different dude. But Carl Maria von Weber wrote a wonderful German opera called Der Freischütz. Der Freischütz roughly translates into the free shooter. That's one of my favorite operas of all time. It's a story about a young hunter who has to win a shooting contest in order to win the hand of his beloved, Agatha. His name is Max, and he wants to win the hand of the daughter of the head forester. He needs to win a shooting contest, but he's been having a string of bad luck. So he teams up with this rather nasty character who teaches him how to cast these magic bullets in the forest. So there's elements of the supernatural, there's elements of good versus evil. I would find it very hard to find an opera with more engaging melodies, more wonderful use of the instruments of the orchestra than Carl Maria von Weber's Der Freischütz, the free shooter, as it's known in English. Certainly, I would recommend any of the great operas of Richard Wagner, but he's a controversial and somewhat challenging figure. And just a little bit of a teaser, I'll have more to say about Wagner in the weeks and months to come. I'm actually preparing a talk on that subject, so more details on that a little bit later on. And then there's so many great operas by Russian composers, just to mention two of the most famous, Boris Godunov by Mussorgsky, and that's actually the proper pronunciation. Some people say Boris Godunov. It's actually Boris Godunov. That's based on a drama by Alexander Pushkin, the first really great Russian poet, playwright, and novelist. And another great opera, also inspired by Pushkin, is Tchaikovsky's Yevgeny Onegin. Sometimes people call it Eugene Onegin in English, but I prefer the original Russian title, Yevgeny Onegin. Now, Yevgeny Onegin was a novel in verse, and I seem to recall Ayn Rand mentioning this novel in one of her Q&As. I forget exactly where, but I can look into that. I think there are very few important works of Russian literature which influenced the Russian consciousness, or I should say the Russian self-consciousness, more than Pushkin's Yevgeny Onegin. According to one commentator, almost every Russian man identifies to some extent with the title character of Yevgeny, and almost every Russian woman at some point identifies with the heroine Tatiana, who falls in love with Onegin and famously sends him a love letter. Unfortunately, that doesn't end well at all. But Tchaikovsky's opera is it's magnificent. He really gets into the characters and the emotions of Pushkin's drama. if you love Tchaikovsky's music and if you love romantic opera and romantic drama at its finest, you really can't do better than Tchaikovsky's Yevgeny Onegin. And I could go on about Russian opera forever, but that's just a bit of a starting point. Now, let me just pause for a moment. I have one other topic that I want to get into, but first of all, let me ask Daniel, are there any questions or super chats that we want to respond to at the moment?
Yes, first we have a super chat from Maria-Lynn. Thank you so much. And then we have a super chat question from Shosbot. Thank you. He's asking, was Antonio Salieri as mediocre as they say he was?
Wonderful question. The answer is absolutely not. Absolutely not. Antonio Salieri was a very great composer and a very great pedagogue, held in very high esteem by his colleagues and many great composers who came after him. So first of all, the depiction you see in Schaffer's play Amadeus and in the Milos Forman film based on the play, which it's a wonderful play, a wonderful film, but not at all historically accurate, not only in the depiction of Salieri and arguably the depiction of Mozart, but also the Emperor Joseph II doesn't come off very well. And some of the other characters, they're actual historical characters, but it's purely a work of fiction. It's not a work of historiography or a work of accurate, documentary style biography. So Salieri was a very prolific and very popular composer. His operas were performed to huge acclaim in Vienna, in Paris, in all the major Italian musical centers. He was really one of the truly successful, and he deserved his success. It's interesting. So some years ago, I did a lecture series on the operas of Gluck, the German composer Christoph Gluck, whom I mentioned a few minutes ago. And actually, Salieri had been a protege, a kind of an informal pupil of Gluck. So actually, the last session I did in this lecture series, I actually took one of Salieri's operas and I played it for the audience, a DVD, and I broke it down. And everybody was so blown away how wonderful the music was, charming melodies, really, really wonderful operas. The opera was called, I believe, Tarare, which is an opera with a historical, sort of a Middle Eastern historical setting. So Salieri really was a great composer. And actually Mozart, the real historical Mozart, respected Salieri as a valued colleague. And yes, it's true that they were in competition with one another, because if you consider the situation in Viennese opera in the 1780s, you had many very fine composers competing for a small number of performances of their operas. So all these composers were in competition with one another, but that doesn't mean that they didn't esteem and value each other. Actually, at the end of his life, so Mozart's last opera that he completed before his death was The Magic Flute, which was premiered at one of the small suburban Viennese theaters in the fall of 1791, just 2 or 3 months before Mozart's death. And Mozart actually described how heartened he was and how moved he was when Salieri came to one of the performances, and Salieri and his then mistress shared a box with Mozart and his wife Costanza, and Salieri applauded vigorously and loudly after all the numbers and shouted bravo, and Mozart was really touched by this, to get this kind of appreciation from a dearly esteemed colleague. Now, Salieri's influence went beyond composition. It went beyond his actual work as an opera composer. He was a very influential teacher. One of Salieri's first pupils was Ludwig van Beethoven. Yes, that's right. So when Beethoven moved to Vienna shortly after Mozart's death. He'd wanted to study with Mozart, but unfortunately that didn't work out. Mozart died at the end of 1791. So Beethoven moved to Vienna, briefly studied with Haydn. And although Haydn was a very great composer and Beethoven esteemed him as a composer, the pupil-teacher relationship didn't quite work out. For one thing, Haydn was very busy. He had his concert tours in London. So he was going very far abroad, and he was busy writing his own symphonies and quartets. Didn't have a lot of time to devote to young Ludwig as a pupil. So Beethoven sought out other teachers, and one of the teachers that he sought out was Salieri. Beethoven learned a lot from Salieri about how to write for the voice. That's a very important skill for a composer. How to set words, whether in Italian or Latin or German, how to set words to music appropriately with the right emphasis, the right stress, the right attention to the lengths of the vowels. Beethoven, and just purely learning about composition, how to structure a musical work. Beethoven learned a lot from Salieri and really esteemed him and valued him tremendously. Franz Schubert was a pupil of Salieri over a period of many years, beginning when Schubert was in his early teens, when he was basically a high school, as we would nowadays say, a high school student. He started studying privately with Salieri, and Schubert continued to consider himself a pupil of Salieri even after he'd written some of his early masterpieces, even after he'd written his first couple of symphonies, string quartets, famous songs like Gretchen at the Spinning Wheel, the Errol King. Even after Schubert had composed these masterpieces, he would still take his musical works in progress and show them to Salieri and get the Italian master's feedback, suggestions, and comments. So that says quite a lot about how important Salieri was. And then probably the last important pupil of Salieri. Salieri died in 1825. By the way, Salieri's dates are very easy to remember. They're nice round numbers. He was born in 1750 and died in 1825. So if you're like me and you like round numbers, very easy to remember Salieri's dates of birth and death. So his last important pupil was Franz Liszt. And Franz Liszt at the time was very young. He was a young pianist who was just, he'd left Hungary and was sort of making his way through Vienna, and then later on he ended up in Paris. He took quite a few lessons with Salieri, learned a great deal from him about how to write for voices, how to write for instruments, how to write great melodies. So there's definitely no question that the popular image of Antonio Salieri is just completely mistaken, completely wrong. So before I go on to my next point, Daniel, are there any other questions or super chats at the moment?
Yeah, we still have a couple of questions. So first, thank you so much, Bonnie, for your super chat. And a super chat question from Christopher. Thank you so much. He's asking, influence of church on music.
Well, so if you're looking at music from the Middle Ages and music from the Renaissance, it's actually hard to find any composers or any musical works that were not influenced by the church, or at least important musical works that were preserved and set down. So here's a little bit of historical background. When we look at music of the past, we have certain sources of information, whether it's archaeological remains of musical instruments that have been preserved, or paintings, sculptures of instruments or musicians playing instruments, or writings about music, whether references to music in Plato's Republic or in Aristotle's Politics or in the writings of later thinkers. But when it actually comes, the most important type of evidence from the past, say the past 1,000 years or more, is actual notated music, actual surviving fragments or complete musical compositions. And really, the history of music, as opposed to the prehistory, the real history of music actually begins during the Middle Ages, say during the reign of Charlemagne, during the reign of Charles the Great, because that's when musicians, and at the time, I'm primarily talking about monks, clerics, scholars, began writing music down. And the reason was, so the most important type of music during the Middle Ages was chant. That's the kind of music that was used in the church, and specifically Gregorian chant was the official music of the Roman Church, the Roman Catholic Church. And around that time, the church was trying to consolidate how the liturgy was celebrated, the ritual of the Eucharist, and including the kinds of texts, the kinds of music that would have been performed. And one of the ways of doing that was to actually write music down. So the melodies would actually be notated. And so a singer in France or a singer in what is now Germany would be performing the same chants, the same texts, and the same melodies that were being used in Rome. So actually, the Roman Church, in a sense, invented musical notation. And that's what makes it possible for all the great music of the past 1,000 years, from the late Middle Ages to the present, to be preserved so that we can study it and perform it and enjoy it. And the church played a very important role in. There was, of course, a lot of secular music. At any given period, there's tons of secular music, whether folk songs or instrumental music. And so much of the great secular music, non-religious music of the past, was ephemeral. It just didn't survive to the present because it wasn't written down. It was either improvised, it was created on the spur of the moment, particularly music for instruments, music for percussion instruments, fiddles, wind instruments. Musicians would show up at a wedding or a party or some kind of celebration, and they would just make up music, or a lot of music was actually transmitted orally. By which I mean there were certain melodies that were learned and passed on from one generation to the next. And everybody watching this video is familiar with the oral transmission of music. And let me pose a simple question to you. Have you ever sung Happy Birthday? Chances are you have. Have you actually seen the sheet music for Happy Birthday? Unless you're a musically trained individual, chances are you're not. So that's what I mean by oral transmission. And most folk songs, Christmas carols, whatever, are transmitted that way. But very little of the popular music, traditional music, folk music was actually written down. There are a few exceptions. So in the Middle Ages, some of the kings and princes were poets as well as musicians. You've probably heard of the troubadours and the trouvères. So the troubadours were in the south of France, the trouvères were in the north of France. And these, by the way, these were not wandering minstrels. These were not jongleurs. These were, for the most part, people from the upper classes or the ruling classes who wrote poetry. Well, Richard the Lionheart was a good example. I think also the English king Henry II wrote some poetry and music. And so many princes and politically powerful individuals wrote music. And so because they were high-born and wealthy and well-educated, they could afford to learn how music was notated. But really, up until the Renaissance, music was almost exclusively the province of the church. Once we get into the, and by the Renaissance, I mean the 15th century, the 16th century, there we start to get a more equal balance between music written for the church, which is actually being written down and published, and music written for outside of church use, vocal music that's secular or instrumental music that's secular. Very important innovation here, of course, was Gutenberg's invention of the printing press, right in the mid 1400s, in the mid 1400s, which made possible a much wider dissemination of music, whether of church music or of non-church music. I would say the importance of church music continued through the period of the Reformation. In fact, music kind of plays an interesting role in the conflict between, on the one hand, the Lutherans, the Anglicans, what's going on in England with Henry VIII, and the Catholic Reformation, or Counter-Reformation, as it used to be called. A lot of great composers, and there's a lot of interesting politics one could get into. For example, the various religious wars in Germany, the various religious wars in England after the death of Henry VIII, Bloody Mary, and then Elizabeth and all of that, and how composers responded to that. I would say that there was some decline of religious music in the 18th and 19th century. You still see great composers writing music. So Bach, for example, wrote a lot of great music, a lot of wonderful music for the church, and still a lot of great music for church being written by composers like Haydn, Mozart, and to a lesser extent by Beethoven, Schubert, and Bruckner, and some later figures. But definitely after 1600, opera becomes the most popular type of music. And even more so after 1700, opera just skyrockets, and more great composers devote more and more of their time to writing operas, whether in Italy or France or even in some of the other countries. And of course, the 19th century was an increasingly secular age with the rise of science, the rise of industrialization. So in the 19th century, you find fewer examples of great composers really devoting a lot of their time and energy to sacred music. You find some, like the Masses of Anton Bruckner. There's the German Requiem by Johannes Brahms, which is a very great, very beautiful work. And there were still composers who took religion very seriously, like the Czech composer Dvořák, who wrote a wonderful mass, a Stabat Mater, a Requiem, which are among the great glories of Catholic Church music. But it becomes something less of a priority compared to operas and symphonies and string quartets and concertos and piano sonatas. So that's just a very brief sort of historical overview in response to that question. So Daniel, you mentioned that there are a few other questions. Anything else?
Yes, we also have a question from Apollo Zeus. He's asking opinion on pop music versus classical music.
I don't follow popular music all that much. I don't listen to a lot of popular music. My take on it is that the purpose of popular music is to reach the widest audience possible. So popular music is deliberately, the music is relatively simple. Often it's relatively formulaic. So there's a very clear sort of verse, refrain sort of structure. It's meant to be relatively undemanding. Of course, there have been in the past certain types of popular music. One could certainly mention the Beatles here, which has been incredibly sophisticated and incredibly fresh and original in terms of its actual musical devices, in terms of the actual use of instruments, the actual melodies and harmonies, the interrelationship between music and text. And I regard these as sort of peaks within the landscape of popular music. And we certainly have to acknowledge that there are these peaks. But I don't have much knowledge of the current landscape of popular music. So it's difficult to have some kind of a historical distance, a sufficient historical distance to be able to say, yeah, at this particular point in the early 21st century, these are the most important influences, and these are the most important creative aspects. So people sometimes ask me the kinds of analytical tools or analytical techniques that you apply to art music, to classical music, analyzing the harmonies, analyzing the structure. Can you apply that to popular music as well? And in some cases, yes. I mean, people have written learned books, or in some cases, popular books, analyzing songs of the Beatles. And there's a lot of wonderful about that. But for the most part, I would say that because popular music is meant to communicate to a broad audience, a lot of it is very much simplified, very much formulaic in its structure. So it doesn't necessarily call out for any kind of detailed analysis. Now, let me clarify. I'm definitely not talking about jazz here. I definitely regard jazz as a form of art. And I remember having discussions about this with colleagues when I was an undergraduate. Is jazz a form of art? Is it a form of entertainment? I would definitely put jazz in the category of art. And I actually took some excellent courses in my undergraduate years on jazz theory and arranging, jazz harmony. I learned a ton about just how much goes into writing even a very simple kind of jazz standard where you have to write for 5 trumpets, 5 trombones, 5 saxophones, and balancing the instruments, balancing the harmonies, writing melodies which have a kind of a spontaneity but also a kind of logic to it. So I have tremendous respect for the great jazz composers and great jazz musicians of the past, whether it's Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, or some later figures like John Coltrane. We're talking about rhythmically and harmonically very, very sophisticated music. And many of the great jazz musicians of the early 20th century were actually inspired by great composers in the European tradition. So if you read a little bit about Coltrane and Ellington, and they certainly knew the music of Debussy and Ravel. They knew the music of Stravinsky, of Bartók. They loved this music. They studied it very avidly. They were strongly influenced by a lot of the innovations, the rhythmic innovations, the melodic innovations of the great composers of the early 20th century. So there's a lot of fascinating overlap there. Okay, I think we have time for one more question, Daniel. Are there
We
any
just have
last...
2 more questions.
Okay, 2 more. So these are the last 2 questions. Yeah.
Yes. So first, thank you, Maria-Lynn, for your super chat. And then we have a question from Shosbot. Thank you so much. He's asking, how important is vocal range for opera singers?
Vocal range, that's an excellent question, hugely important. And I have to stress that throughout history, all the major opera composers, when they were actually writing their operas, and this is true of Handel, of Mozart, of Rossini, Verdi, and I would say I think this is even true of opera composers up to the present day. Opera composers work very closely with singers, the singers that they are writing for. Now, composing an opera is a fairly big deal. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, even for a ridiculously prolific opera composer like Donizetti, who wrote 70 operas over the course of actually very short career. He died, I think he died in his 40s. But composers work very closely with their singers, and an opera composer would generally have a specific performance in mind. So when a composer is writing opera, he'll say, okay, this opera is going to be performed in such and such a month in Naples or Verona or Rome or Paris or Vienna. And the singers who are going to be premiering these roles are such and such. So the composer will actually know which singers he's writing for. And what Mozart often did when he was writing an opera is, first of all, he'd write all the instrumental stuff, the overture and any dances or whatever, and then he would go to whatever city, whether it was Munich or Mannheim or Vienna, he would go to the city where the opera was going to be performed, and he would actually, or Prague, he wrote a couple of operas for Prague as well, and he would work with the singers day after day to make sure that the arias, the actual songs in the opera, suited not just the range, the high and low of the singer, but also the quality of the singer's voice. Is this singer a more lyric singer, or are they a more dramatic singer? Do they have a bigger, more powerful voice, or is this a singer with a smaller, more intimate voice? And so composers have always tailored the roles in their operas to particular artists. And then what happens when an opera is revived for subsequent productions? That's a whole other question. There, the singers to some extent have to adapt to pre-existing music, although some composers like Handel and even Mozart would often write new arias when an opera was performed in a new city. So for example, Mozart wrote Don Giovanni for Prague, but then when Don Giovanni had its Viennese premiere, Mozart wrote a whole bunch of new arias for the new Don Ottavio, the new Donna Elvira, and the other major roles in the opera to suit their particular range, their particular voice type. And later on, you even see Rossini and Verdi and later composers doing this as well. Maybe not so much after sort of Puccini and later composers, but definitely you do still see this in the 19th century. So are there any final super chats, any final comments before we wrap up, or announcements?
We have a super chat from Maria-Lynn. Thank you so much. And then a super chat question from Adam. He's asking, do you consider the contemporary Latvian composer, and I put his name in the chat, do you consider him neo-romantic, neoclassical, or modernist?
Oh, I will have to, I'm not familiar with his work, so I'll take that as a homework assignment. I'll go and look into his music, and then I'll get back to you and maybe come up with a short one-sentence comment that we can put. I'll just put my comment or my response to that in the chat after the video is up. But I'm very intrigued. I always like learning about interesting composers that I haven't heard of. So thank you very much for that recommendation.
And we also have a super chat from Steven. Thank you so much. And that's all.
Okay, in that case, thank you all. Thank you so much for your questions. I found them very stimulating, very invigorating. This has been an excellent discussion, and I have to say, this has been a very pleasant way for me to spend my birthday. So thank you all very much, and see you next time.